thank you very much. And Bernie, please take it away. Thank you.
Yeah, when I talked to Mayor, I figured, well, why don't we do this in the right sequence? Because we do it first, and then the cartridge people have to take it from there. So, of course, my expertise and my experience is in disc cutting and the systems that cut the discs. And I've been living with vinyl and mastering for something like 50 years now. So I'm, it's hard to believe, but I'm one of the old timers in it. And it's interesting to also take a look at what's happened over those 50 years when it used to be the primary device to carry music. Everybody was interested in buying records. Now it's come full circle, and there's a whole new generation that have discovered this new thing because they've kind of they didn't grow up with vinyl. So a lot of young people think that this is a whole new thing. And in fact, to the point where I've heard stories where young kids, 12, 13 years old, they hear about it and they get a record and they pull it out and they say, well, how does it play? What does it do? How do you do this? I mean, what is it? They have no idea what it is. And what they don't realize is that this goes all the way back to Edison. The principle behind it is kind of, in a way, kind of primitive, except that it's much more, of course, sophisticated than when Edison did the first recording, but the basic principle is the same. What we're really doing is, in the groove, we're mechanically cutting a miniaturization, very minute miniaturization of what you want the speaker to do. Basically, that's what we're doing. So if the groove goes like this, the cone of the speaker goes like that. It's just that it's miniaturized, cartridge plays it back, it's amplified, and the speaker moves. And so that's pretty basic. But that's some of what we like about it too, because it's very straightforward. Not a lot of processing, not a lot of conversions like in digital and so forth, which affect sound. Everything seems to affect sound. As being audiophiles, everyone here is very aware of that. Just the wiring makes a difference. I mean, even to the point where we have the cables going to our cutting system on blocks of wood and so forth. And of course, my engineers, my tech guys, are always giving me A/B comparisons and so forth. So one day they had cut a couple cuts on a disc, and they said, okay, I'm going to play this cut, and I'm going to play this cut. Which one do you like? Do you like this one, or do you like this one? Of course, I don't know what they've done. I'm just picking out what I think sounds the best. And it was pretty obvious there was a difference. And so I said, well, I like this one. And what did you do? What did you change in the system? And blah, blah. All they changed was the blocks of wood. And the blocks of wood were like out of a different wood, and they were shaped a little different. And there was an obvious difference. I mean, I wouldn't have believed it, because I know that a lot of things do, but I mean, it is to the point with me where I feel now that everything makes a difference. It's like, it's amazing. I mean, we've done cutting when we're doing cutting for the pressing plant. If we're cutting like more than one set of lacquers, we could cut one lacquer, one right after the other. Same music, same everything, same system. When it comes out of the plant, depending on how the plating is, they sound different. It's just like all of these processes, all these things that everything goes through will probably change the sound. If you compare them, you don't know until you've compared it to something else. You never know until you go back to, say, the source, which is what we're constantly doing all the time anyway, because it is kind of a moving target, this kind of thing, especially when it comes to vinyl. When vinyl started coming back in, it started crossing over about 5 years ago into mainstream, Because as you as audiophiles know that vinyl's been around all along. And in fact, we started to ramp it up in the mid-90s with classic records and all of those things, all of those recordings that we started to re-release on vinyl. And the audience kept growing and growing and growing. And then finally, and then with people like Michael Fremmer, who were, really publicizing it and so forth and advocating getting into it, it's now grown into the mainstream. Now at my studio, we're doing anything that comes out on the market, any new recording, all the latest pop artists, hip hop, it doesn't matter. It's all available, becoming available in vinyl, which is really quite interesting. And there's a lot of research on it, people trying to figure out why is it so popular. But, when it comes right down to it, it's a nice package. And it actually is a closer connection with the artist in a lot of ways, and it's very physical. And I think they misjudged the public. I think the public still likes physical media. Not everyone. Some people are content with streaming, even with inferior sound. They seem to put up with it. But there's still a big segment of the population that wants to have a bigger experience. So, and they do say that I'm hearing stories now of young people that actually sit around and listen to music because they're playing records. Because it stops their day. They stop, they have to go through this ritual, open up, and they have the big package. Like it's getting them involved in this record, the package, the pictures, all that. The record is very physical. They put it on the turntable, put the arm on the turntable. They actually tend to sit down and listen, which is a lot of what they're not doing. A lot of them aren't doing, or they weren't up to that time because they were like, have the earbuds on, they're working on their computer, they're working on their cell phone or whatever, and the music's just going on in the background. And my take on it was that a lot of music listeners were actually missing a lot of what's there. Unless you sit down and really listen to something, you're not that involved. You're not going to get you're going to get something out of it, of course. It's kind of like a background to your life. But there's so much more that you can get out of music if you actually get involved. Actively listen. So let me get back to this whole thing about discs. Now, discs being this kind of like primitive medium, but now we're able to do 2 channels in one groove, and we have full frequency response, 20 to 20,000 cycles, or even further. It actually goes out further, the cutting systems. But to accomplish that, of course, it's much more sophisticated than what Edison did. In fact, Edison's cut was vertical. It was a vertical cut. But now the cut that we make in the disc is doing both. It's working laterally, the groove is moving this way, and it's also moving up. It's causing the playback stylus to go up and down because it's getting smaller and bigger, and then it's going laterally and it's going vertically. So the playback cartridge is going to have a big obstacle course here to follow, which means that in order to follow all this complexity that can be embedded in the groove, you're going to have to spend some money. Because the cartridge is going to have to respond to something, radical maybe here and there, like some big crescendo or especially our biggest problem in disc cutting is sibilances, high frequencies, which are very fast movements, or strong transients, which means that the cartridge has to move fast. And so it's got to be compliant. But I'm sure there are a lot of other things that it can't be just loose. It's got to be damped. I don't know what it has to be done. They're going to have to explain that. But it can be a problem trying to make a record that will track on most players. And this is another thing I was talking to them out there. When we go to make a record, we kind of need to know sometimes whether it's for the audiophile market or whether it's for mainstream market, because it's got to track on more players if it's going to be like pop stuff. It could be on these $100 Urban Outfitter players, which you better have something that's not too radical, or else it'll either throw the stylus out of the groove or it'll just distort. So, because when you really think about it, all of this stuff that we're dealing with here is mechanical. And when you think about mechanics now, you got these stylus, and you've got a shank, and it's these coils, and you've got all this stuff and possible resonances. Cutter heads have resonances. In order to get them linear is very difficult. To get something mechanical to be really flat, the response to really be flat. No speaker is perfectly flat. It's going all over the place because it's got little peaks and dips and peaks and dips. So you try to minimize those as best you can with the design, but it's not perfect. So there's always going to be this struggle to try to make this stuff at least have a flat response. But aside from that, doesn't necessarily mean that it's not going to have good quality. And in fact, my take on it is I don't care if something's a little bit off here and there. You know, it's not perfectly, it can be plus or minus whatever, a dB or whatever. The main thing is the quality. Because sometimes what it takes to make something flat kills the quality. And you might look at if you're real intellectual about it, and you're a real geek that way, and you only care about flat response, you say, well, the flat response one must sound the best. No, not necessarily. It's true in preamplifiers, it's true in amplifiers. I've found this all along, that it's not, you'd be more satisfied if it was the highest quality, and not all of the stuff it takes to make it really, really flat. So you can always destroy the sound trying to make it look good on the test equipment. Because all of these old microphones that made all these recordings that we love, back in the 50s and 60s and so forth, when you check them out, they don't check like the new ones, but they sure feel more comfortable, they're more musical to you. You enjoy listening to them. So why is that? This is this unknown factor. That's why when I do seminars and when I talk about audio, I always talk about the fact that the only thing that really makes a difference are your ears. That's the only thing that's going to tell you if it's really, really good. It's because even test equipment doesn't really, it can't really tell you what this piece of equipment's going to do on a complex signal. You can check out harmonic distortion, you can check intermodulation distortion, you can tell all you, but those are very minimal. They give you an idea. But when it comes to something like music, forget it. There's nothing that's going to measure that, really, except your ears. Your ears are going to tell you. And a lot of what I like to do is I'm always comparing to the original. What am I getting on the disc compared to the original? You know, that's how I really know if I've got something really accurate. So then there are adjustments that don't show up on test equipment that you have to do to make these things all sound perfect or as close to perfect as possible. But, you know, it's one of those things where you never quite get there, but you're always pursuing it, always trying to find something that's going to make it, just like in high-end audio. There's always some new amplifier, some guy that's come out with something that might just be a little bit better, just a little bit. You know, so it's worth the effort. So let me talk a little bit about the disc itself. Now, being kind of a technology, an old technology, actually, as I said, all the way back to Edison, but the flat disc was in the early part of the last century when they came out with the flat disc. Now, the flat disc was easy to manufacture because cylinder discs were very hard to manufacture. But because of that, there are a number of problems that have occurred, or that occur when you have a flat disc. For one thing, the linear speed is constantly changing. In other words, the amount of material that goes by the cutter head when the cutter head is responding to the signal, the amount of material is 4 times as much on the outer edge as toward the label. So if you take one circumference of the disc and think about the same signal here is going to be spread out around this one, if you stop time, you take one circumference and you have, say, a voice saying something. Now on the inside, there's only this much space. So the density now has increased 4-fold. That's why when you play a disc, you tend to get more distortion closer to the label. It gets harder and harder to extract that signal. In fact, if you have a lot of high frequency information, you're never going to get it because the cutting stylus is very sharp. And the playback stylus can't be as sharp as the cutting tool that cuts the disc. So if it was, you'd just cut a new disc. You'd put the playback on and you'd scrape it all. You'd destroy the disc. So what happens is, if you have enough high frequency information toward the label, those little indentations that are on the edge of the groove that are the high frequencies, the playback stylus can't fit all the way in and back and forth. It has to move back and forth in order to get that signal. It has to have a negative and positive effect, to create a sine wave or whatever. So if you look at the groove on the edge of the groove is closing as you get toward the label. It's getting less space is going by when it's cutting it. So now the playback stylus can't get all the way in and out. So we can watch it when we're doing test tones. We can take a 15,000 cycle tone. We can cut it on the outside of the disc, and we can move the cutter in while we're playing it back simultaneously, and the high end will start going down because it can't really fit in there at the real high frequencies. Now, a lot of things you might not notice it, but transients, like the drum hit or even the pluck of a bass instrument, you wouldn't think so, but it has a high frequency component. That attack of that instrument is a high frequency component. And so you still need to reproduce good high end, in order to get that nice pluck of the guitar or the bass or whatever, or a kick drum, all of that. Because if you didn't have that, it would just be rumble in the bottom end part of it. It wouldn't have the attack. And the attack is what gives you presence. That's what makes it spring off the speaker. So the better the transients are, the more stuff jumps off the speakers and has a presence. So it can move the air and fast, can snap it off of the cones. So all of this plays into, a lot of times, on how good the playback system is. Because, I remember I was working on an Ella Fitzgerald record, and we were cutting it, and we were playing it back because of sibilance. We were worried about how well it was going to track. Now we don't have a real high end cartridge, but a good cartridge, and we were getting splattering on the S's, just tearing sound. They weren't clean. They weren't pure, clean, nice like the tape. So our systems, we can run them up to 78 RPM. So again, this linear speed. So we ran it up to 78 RPM as clean as could be. The S's were absolutely perfect. Now, there are signals that, I don't care if you have a $10,000 cartridge, you might not be able to track it. But the more expensive and the better the cartridge, the more information you're going to get out of that groove. And there's quite a bit of information in there, is what it turns out to be. Because I'm telling you, when we cut on the outside of a disc, and we're playing back simultaneously, and we have the mass, we're listening to the original, and then we can A-B them, just switch right between them. The systems are so good that it's almost impossible to hear the difference. I mean, it's really, really hard. Sometimes you just can't tell. But there always is a difference after it comes back from the pressing plant. So there's some inherent things that go on here. Again, even though it's mechanical, we're not re-recording. When you make a vinyl disc, it's all electroplating, and pressing on vinyl, and it's all just mechanical stuff. But all of those processes do tend to affect it. Plus, it's on vinyl now, it's not on lacquer, and that might be a factor too. It's hard to say where it changes, but they have to go through like about it's like 5 processes. So when they get our lacquer, they have to spray it with a fine coating of silver so that it's conductive in an electroplating bath. And then it goes into electroplating bath where it's plated so that it's a liquefied nickel is what it is. Nickel is what they use. It's a nice hard material. But that's a metal master. Now, one of the later things that people are doing, audiophile guys that put out vinyl are doing, is they're taking the first negative off of the lacquer and pressing. But of course, when that wears out, they have to go back and cut another set of lacquers. So in order to avoid that, the plants make what we call a metal master, the first negative, but then they plate that, because you can't keep plating the lacquer once. That's it. So now you got the metal master, which is a negative. Then you plate that and you get a mother, which is a positive. Now you can play that. It's metal, but you can play it and make sure that it came out okay and there aren't any defects, pop, sticks, all the things that we know can happen to vinyl. And if that's okay, then you can make a stamper from the mother. Now we're back to a negative, and then you press it and you have vinyl. You have a vinyl pressing. So you've got all these processes that go on. So that's why it's a difficult medium, because anything in those grooves you're going to hear. It's pure analog. And so it's not in a different language like CDs. CDs don't recognize anything except ones and zeros. But in vinyl, anything in that groove you're going to hear. So that's why it's so difficult to press a record, why it's so difficult to really get a really pristine, perfect pressing. I said that like 5 years ago when this started to get really big, I said, okay, now we're in for a lot of headaches. Because it is. It's very difficult because of these various limitations and various drawbacks. But it can be great too, if everything is addressed and everything is done properly. So it's just, and I think that the standards are higher now because it's all come out of the audiophile area, even the mainstream stuff. So now there's a lot of, the pressing plants are just at a higher level of quality. Their standards are higher. Now, I don't know what's going to happen is, because, for a few years now, all of the plants are so far behind, they're like months behind, always. So, and we are getting more inconsistencies. We're getting pressings, test pressings that have more noise than they used to. Some plants no, some are perfect, but or almost or as good as they get. But it is one of those mediums that has things that you really need to check and address to make sure that it is going to perform well for the listener. CDs only have one limitation, and that's peak level. You can't exceed the peak, or else you're going to clip it, the audio. But other than that, there are no limitations, except it does have those little artifacts and various things that people don't like about CDs, but they don't really have limitations in the way vinyl does. So vinyl, that's why I'm saying it's a bigger headache for us, because we have to work very hard and we have to spot check and cut things, test cut things, and make sure that they're going to track. So there's a lot of effort that goes into making vinyl. But it can be great, because if it comes from a good source, it's probably going to be the most natural musical thing that you can buy. Because, just the fact of it being digital does make everything sound slightly artificial. Even though intellectually sometimes it's cleaner, clearer, there's still some soul that's missing. That happens to me. So when we were doing, like last year we did 100 Blue Note albums from the master tapes, and we did a very special run for Capitol. Capitol owns Blue Note now, but they wanted these archival 192 sampling rate transfers, And so we had a highly simplified system. We built our own computer system. We built with our own power supplies and all that stuff. And as good as the 192 and a real hot-rodded computer, coming off of that tape, we couldn't get it just wasn't there. When we played it back off the 192, it still wasn't there. But I think we could get closer with a really good pressing and a good playback cartridge. So I think that's a good lead-in for the cartridge guys. But let me say one thing about the construction. The cutter head, just think of the cutter head as this. The cutter head is like 2 miniature speakers. Instead of a cone hooked to it, it's got a cutting tool hooked to it. So you've got 2 coils that are at 45-degree angles. Now it's more complicated than just 2 coils. It's got a feedback coil. It's got motional feedback. So it's got it's a little more complex than that. But basically, it's like 2 speaker voice coils that are hooked to a common rod, which we call a torque tube. And then there's a cutting tool made out of sapphire or ruby, and it's heated almost to red hot, and it cuts the disc. But that's the construction of the head. So, and that's how you get, and that's why it's going to have to move up and down and everything, because you're getting 2 separate signals, left and right, and the resultant is that some things are in phase, some are out of phase, some are. So that playback is, that cutter is just going everywhere. So they've got to do something to get it out of the groove. So, are there any questions? Yeah, mine.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
You could argue that the death of LPs in the late 1990s was due to brick walling and poor disc practice at the time. What's being done today to ameliorate brick walling, and what type of software filtering, what type of stuff do you do to increase the dynamic range of what we're hearing today?
Well, for now, we're coming at it from not being mainstream, as being the mainstream promo tool. Because when it started to come back, all we cared about was quality, because it was primarily for audiophiles. So now we liked it, because we could take everything out of the circuit. Even if it was a pop record, we could take everything out and just cut it with full dynamics and everything. But the problem is now, and even back then, like you said, when it was really starting to sound kind of trashy and stuff, because when it gets too dense and the information is too complex, vinyl doesn't do very well. So it was the main promo tool, though, for a long time. And everybody was in the level wars, even with vinyl. So all that pop stuff was compressed, limited, made as loud as you could make it. And every time they would improve cartridges to track cleaner, we'd push the level up. So it would get up to the distortion level, we'd back it down a little so it wasn't too annoying. But this is what clients wanted. This is what record companies wanted. It's still that way with CDs, with a lot of pop music, because they're still part of the promo thing. The promotional guys, they just can't bring themselves to let it breathe as much as it could, and because of that, it's not as musical. So, and it's happening now. We do a lot of transfers now. All they want is for the music to be in vinyl. And it comes actually off the CD, basically. Even if it's a high sampling rate and high bit rate, if the master is that, they might still give us the processed one with plugins and all kinds of things to make the thing loud. And so it doesn't matter if it's 192, it still sounds terrible. But they want it in vinyl because the kids want it. Now that it's crossing over into that. And sometimes we can't do anything about it. Because even if you liked a pop artist and you would want a 192 without all of the processing, they won't let us do it because they don't want us to spend the money. So they just say, oh, let's cut it off the CD files. So we'll just cut it off the CD. So what you get is another generation. Now it's getting worse than the CD. So the best ones, of course, are the ones that go back and we rerun it without all the processing. We might run it into the computer because a lot of these things need a lot of computer work. like editing or special fades and various things like that. So we still have to run it into a computer, but at least we can take, if it's an original 96 or 192, we can keep it at that for the disc cutting. And we don't have to put in all that processing. And most of those artists don't want the processing for the vinyl version. And it goes back to the fact that the vinyl is not really competing in the same way. When it comes to vinyl, as I said earlier, there's a break here. You're not really comparing to what you just heard. You stop, take a record off, you put another one on, you sit down, and when you're in that position to where you're involved in it, you just set it where you like it. It's not a playlist. It's not where things are just going. See, what they're worried about on these digital files and CDs and streaming and all of these things that are digital, what they're worried about is if things are on playlists, and if your record comes along and it's low because it doesn't have a lot of processing, they're worried that they're not going to be noticed. The artists and the producers, they want it to sit in there with everything else. So when theirs comes on, they get noticed. Or people don't think, see, because some people are kind of ignorant about that. When something's lower level, they think there's something wrong with it. What they don't know is that it probably sounds better. Well, I have to just turn the level up. But this is the problem with mainstream pop. Jazz stuff and all that, we try to put full dynamics in. We don't do any compression in vinyl cutting, but some of it's built into the digital files that we get. So there's nothing we can do about it.
Thank you.
So now the cartridge. Oh, you got it. Yeah.
Could you clarify how long the sapphire cutting stylus lasts, and what kind of settings are available on the cutting head to make sure that the engineer can go back to the exact same settings that they started out with before the cutting stylus wore out?
Well, we don't really notice. Actually, when the stylus starts to wear, it just starts to get noisy. Because I think, and we always try to change it way before we'd hear anything. I think we get maybe 16 hours off of it, something like that. We don't run it for a long time. I don't know whether there's a discernible difference in the sound, but if we let it go too long, there will be the noise floor will start to come up. Now, of course, the noise floor on a lacquer, there is none. There's really no noise on a lacquer, but the vinyl does have noise. But of course, we don't want to have any of that because we don't want anything to add up. So it's changed actually fairly often because I mean, there are cutting tools that are made out of diamonds. They're made in Japan, and they last 10 times longer. But the problem with that is, if it lasts 10 times longer, the period where it's starting to get noisy is going to be much longer. It's going to, I'd rather change it more often. And there is a problem with the diamond one, because diamonds create a lot of static electricity with the lacquer. When you're trying to cut lacquer, you can't just have a diamond cutting it. You can't get the piece that's cut out of the lacquer away from it. It's too much static electricity. So the Japanese embedded a jewel, like a ruby or sapphire, industrial sapphire, right in the tip, just above the cutting, right in the flat part of where the tip is, which is kind of risky because they break now and then because we used them for a while. But that bleeds it off. And so they do work. But I would prefer to change them more often, and just in case there is this kind of period where it's maybe not quite as pristine, at least it won't be in that period for a long time. So but some of that stuff is hard to hear. It's very minute. But so it gets down to trying to get that information out of the groove. Or you wanted to take a break? Or another question?
Go ahead.
Another question? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, just a quick question. I think one of the reasons why vinyl playback has held on so long is because playback or the manufacturers that create the playback devices have continued to innovate. Unlike
Yeah.
something like 35 millimeter, they really stopped innovating, and that's why we've seen the demise. But what about cutting head technology? What do you see in the future? What are some of the is there any room left to innovate? Is my question for creating the record.
Well, I mean, actually, there is work being. We have a hybrid head. We have a head that the guy that builds these heads and repairs them and stuff. We've been working with him for the last 6-8 months on a cutter head that we think is going to be better, and we've found that it's a little smoother in response, but it's not quite done yet. But there are things that we would like to improve. I don't know if anyone else is doing anything, though. I don't think Neumann is. They're kind of like, there's only people repairing them, as far as I know. And it could happen, because now I understand that Tulex Alpha in Sweden is now manufacturing presses again. So that's a sign that people are building, starting to build the industry back from the manufacturing side. And maybe somebody will come up with something. We're trying to come up with something, because we've never walked away from vinyl. But I don't know if anybody else is. I mean, the cutter heads are pretty good. See, we could cut more than we can play back. Our biggest problem is playback. That's where a lot of and just good pressings. The noise factor and all of that, trying to do a pressing without noise. So a lot of the drawbacks are there, I think. Yeah.
Can you share with us any stories of working with any artists that cared more about the quality you're going after than others? Some of the people that impressed you along the way through your career, or really were out there and went for it, or even some interesting stories that have come about over the years?
Well, yeah, I mean, I have worked, like I was saying, in the mid-90s, we started to get involved, started ramping up this whole audiophile thing again. I mean, they were always making them here and there, but when Classic Records came on the scene, they were pretty aggressive about, we did maybe 500-600 albums for them over a 5-year period maybe. And they were pretty determined to do everything to the best possible quality. In fact, a lot of albums like Kind of Blue by Miles Davis, or Time Out by Dave Brubeck, or a lot of Living Stereo RCA Red Seals, a lot of those recordings were done on 3-track. And we went directly from the 3 tracks. Now, even at RCA in those record companies, they mixed it down to a 1/4-inch 15 and then mastered from that. But we took the 3 channels, and we even added, we have in our studio 3 of the EMT, the German reverb chambers. They're mechanical, but they're big. The same ones that were used on all those albums. And we fed that in, comparing it to the original, trying to get the same balances and so forth, but just better quality. And so we went to the trouble of actually cutting right from the 3-track. So we had to do a lot of adjustments on the fly, because with tape, you can't stop anything. With digital, you can put one tune in and then put another tune in, but not with analog. With when you're cutting a disc, you can't stop it. You've got to cut all 3, 4, 5 tunes in a row. That's it. So you have to, if you have adjustments on each tune, you better be all prepared. Because I know when I first went to work for Contemporary, Lester Koenig was the biggest perfectionist I think I ever worked with. Sometimes it would take us 2 days to cut one jazz album, because they were direct to 2-track, and if it was a good performance, he was a big one for performance. If it was a good performance but the mix was a little off, we tried to correct for it in mastering. And there might be a number of tunes like that, 4 or 5 tunes on one side, and if you blow the 5th tune, you got to go back and do all 4 of the first 4 again. So that's why, like direct to disc, my take on it is that a little anemic a lot of times because I've been on those sessions. And if you try to do 3, 4, 5 tunes in a row, all the musicians are conservative. They're worried about making mistakes because they have to go back and do all the other 4 if they mess up the 5th one. Probably the best direct-to-disc records are ones where there's just 1 or 2 tunes on a side. Because I'm telling you, everybody gets anxious and worried about making mistakes, and the performances aren't great. And that's the whole thing, too, that happens with audiophile recordings, is that a lot of times they might sound good, but musically, forget it. What we really want is both, you know? So that's just the way the world runs, so, you know? I mean, it's hard to cover all the bases. And, you know, we've been trying to do that for years, but some people are better than others. And we all just keep plugging away at it because we love it, you know? It's our life. Now, here's an interesting recording. Has anybody ever heard of a guy named Mr. Bungle? Mr. Bungles, or there's a rock group or kind of a pop group. They had me make a record. Now this was like it's like kind of a very esoteric kind of interesting rock group that mixed in all kinds of things like jazz and all these very, very interesting kind of recordings. But they wanted me to, at the 3rd cut of the album, they had 6 cuts on the side. The 3rd cut, they wanted me to interleave another tune, so that if you played the 3rd tune separately, you could pick up this one that's hidden. If you played it from the beginning, it would just follow the 6 tunes, no problem. You wouldn't know anything. But if you played only the 3rd tune, you might pick up this one, and then it goes, shh, don't tell anyone. You know, but in order to do that, think about this. In order to do that, one thing you have to do is you have to go, the cutting systems are all automated so that they change the depth of the cut depending on the vertical information, and they change the spacing of the grooves, all with computers, so that it's always got the right size groove for the playback. And it's saving space by putting the grooves as close as possible all the way across the record, so that you don't go into the label unless it's a long side. So what we had to do is when we get to the 3rd tune, we had to go to fixed pitch so that the grooves were evenly spaced, so that you could put another one in between all the others. So this took hours. So we had to go to fixed pitch, and we had to have enough room to interleave another tune. And then you cut the whole side with that 1/3 tune that's fixed pitch. Now you have to, by hand, put the put the head down so that the cutting stylus goes right at the beginning of the 3rd tune in between the other grooves. And then cut that whole tune, and then let it keep going until you get to the spread, and then lift the head. So that's why it took hours. Because you could cut, I would cut the whole side, and then I'd miss it. I'd have to cut the whole side again, so I could put the interleaved one in. It took me 4 or 5 times to do it, because it's hard to see the cutting tool and the grooves and know how to get it in between. So that's one of the oddball records that I did. If you ever see Mr. Bungle, get that album, because it's really. But we've done a lot of weird things. We've made 45. We've made 10-inch discs that look like just a big 45. All of the parameters, everything. The label is big. It's got a photograph of the insert and everything. People do all kinds of gimmicky things with vinyl. I remember at A&M when there was an artist called Lee Michaels. He was a big rock guy way back, and he liked to do crazy things. And so I was in the cutting room, and we were doing a single for him. And he needed to take it to the meeting on Monday to play for the executives, for the releases of the week. It's going to be a single release. And I was just joking around with him, because the cutting system, we can go inside out or outside in. We can cut either way. So I says, hey, we ought to cut this thing inside out. He says, really? What's that? And I said, well, I could cut it and I can make it look like a regular record, except it has to play from the inside out. He says, do that, you know. So I talked to him a few days later. We made this disc, and he says, yeah, I got in on the meeting late, and they were trying to play it, and they would put the stylus down, and it would go this way, and then it would stop, you know, because we put a lockout out there so it wouldn't damage the stylus, but we put a lockout groove out way out, and they'd put it in a little further, and they'd hear it fading out. they couldn't figure out what was going on. But he happened to get there and was able to, you know, let him know how to play this thing. But because, you know, way back, when they had cutting systems at the transmitters at radio stations, they used to delay radio programs from the east. They used to delay them, and they'd had 2 lathes, and they would cut the first half of a show outside in and the second half inside out. They did that so that you wouldn't hear any quality change or wouldn't notice it, because it would gradually get less and less and less, and then it would come back. But it wouldn't be this big jolt going from the first half of the show to the second half of the show. So those just little odd things about discs do go on. and in way back when I first got in the business, all the mastering, when a mastering engineer was called that because all he did was cut a master disc. He didn't do anything to it. If you were at Columbia or you were at RCA or Capitol, you didn't do anything in the mastering room except know how to cut a disc that would track well and had no defects in it that way. But if the producer wanted to add high end or low end or do some equalization on one of the tunes because it didn't fit, he had to go back in the studio and he had to make a tape copy with that equalization and those adjustments in it, insert it in the assembly, give it to the mastering engineer, and the mastering engineer would cut it flat. Now, I was fortunate because I got in the mid-'60s, and Contemporary Records, which I'm sure you all know Contemporary Records. Well, I worked in that studio, and because they did a lot of direct-to-2-track recordings and they were really into high quality, they had built a cutting system that had a lot of adjustments. In fact, they had even adjustments where you could pan across high frequencies, different bands of the frequency spectrum. You could pan it, you could do this, you could move things around in mastering. So when I went to work there, they weren't making a lot of new records. And so Lester Koenig, the owner of the company, decided, well, since I have this engineer now, I'm going to make the studio available to other producers in Hollywood and Los Angeles. So all of a sudden I started getting this reputation because I could adjust things. You know, I happened to get in at the right time. You know, and of course with the knowledge I had gained from working with Lester, because he was like a real quality conscious guy. He was a good guide. And we worked together for quite a while, so I had this one-on-one teacher on how to cut a good disc. So I applied that to people that came in. Pretty soon I was doing all kinds of people, the Doors, all of the A&M stuff, it's so then I got in on right when it started to become a creative process. So and then it's kept growing and growing, and now it has a lot of similarities to what mixers do, because what are we trying to do? You know, what as engineers, we're trying to create a more direct, better connection of the emotional feeling in the music. Because music, let's face it, music is kind of like one man's or a person's portrayal of their experience as a human being emotionally. It's an emotional portrayal in a way. We all have the same emotions. There's only so many emotions, and it doesn't. And I've had to learn this to be not prejudiced, because I'm an old bebop jazz person and a classical person, and I used to be a snob. I used to, when I was a teenager, it was like, I was in the beatnik period, and it was like, hey, only bebop, only jazz. But now, after being in, doing all this pop music, doing all this stuff, I realized that, it all has a place, actually. Because, you can't, take, for instance, something like dance music. That has a very narrow range. You want to do something that feels, it has this kind of feeling that wants for partying, for parties, for getting up and dancing or whatever. That's what you're going for. And if you really believe in it, you'll probably make a pretty good record or recording. If you don't believe in it and you pander to it, it probably won't work. Even because you get somebody that's really intellectual about music, they say, well, I can do that. It doesn't really work that way. And the thing is, I realized that, it has a place, though. I mean, I don't sit at home and listen to dance music. But at a party, it might be great. Try to put on a piece of classical music at a party. Not going to work. And the classical music can never create that feeling. There's no way. It's incapable of it. It's too cumbersome. So when you look at it that way, you realize, well, okay, so it's got a place. So it all kind of has a place. Some music tells a bigger emotional story. It's like a big piece of classical music, takes you for quite a ride. If it's a good piece of classical music, you're going to spend a little, you have to get involved, you have to get involved, you're going to get everything out of it. Some other music some days you might just want something schmaltzy in the background, and fine. That's good. It fits your mood. Or you want something that's easily accessible. But all of it is a person's view of their experience, their emotional experience. And it's actually going to enrich all of us, because we're going to see other points of view of the same emotion that we all know. So there's always something there. And that's what I've learned through the years. And that's what mixers have to know too. Because if I'm sitting at the console and I put on a polka record, now, I'm not a big polka music listener, but I still have to I have to not be prejudiced. I have to be able to feel this music and how it's affecting me emotionally. And I want to make that connection between the music and how I'm feeling it better. Now, I'm trying to help the artist and the producer realize their dream, though. So I'm interfacing with them. I want to kind of know if I'm going in a good direction, because I can take it in a direction that actually is valid, but it's not what they had in mind. So I have to know when I turn equalization knobs, or when I do this, or try certain kinds of compression or limiting or whatever I'm going to do to it, I have to know if I'm making it better. And when I do seminars on this, I tell the engineers, I say, hey, okay, you walk in, you're sitting at the console, this guy brings in a polka record or whatever, and you put it on, how do you know what to do? Do you just make it loud? I mean, how do you know what to do? What's going to tell you that you're doing anything that's worthwhile? It's only you. You have to be able to open yourself up emotionally to it and be able to feel when you turn this knob, is it really a better experience? Am I getting a better connection with this music? Is it connecting with me, so that's the object. And a mixer does the same thing. He's creating it's even a bigger thing for a mixer, because now you've got a real blank canvas. And the object there is to create to me, the best mixes are creating an environment for the music to live. And it's like a special environment that actually transports the listener and moves you into a space where you're very intimate with that music. And that's why the best mixers know how to handle echo and reverb, because they create a space where the music lives. And that's, all of those things create a bigger and better and more fulfilling experience.